There's no flash photography, no photography, no recordings. None. We're live.
It's a great honor to be here and introduce Ingo Swann, a man who truly resides outside of space and time. I'm very happy that Ingo had the chance to be here and tell us about his enormous contributions to human perception and remote viewing. He'll get to describe his valuable contributions that he has made and dozens of other people have claimed credit for over the years. So I'm very happy that Ingo is going to be here and tell us about his work. When I say he's outside of space and time, I recall an interview that Ingo once had at SRI where a young woman said, "Mr. Swann, are you able to go out of your body?" And he said, "Sweetheart, just because you're here, I'm having one of my few in-the-body experiences." So we're very blessed today that Ingo has come with his mind and his body and is going to share one of his in-the-body experiences with us today. Thank you very much, Ingo.
You know, there's a lot of enthusiasm here in this great 4th annual conference. The enthusiasm is really wonderful. You all seem so nice. And one could dare to think that remote viewing might be here to stay. Is it? Yes. Well, come on. This morning I'm going to tell you why it's here to stay, and it might not be for any of the reasons that you think. When I was finally made to come here under dress by various people, come out of my little cave, I agonized about what I should talk about. And since I don't give public lectures at all anymore, I thought there should be an occasion where I say something about the past, but also 30 years into the future. Because remote viewing and various aspects related to it have a future for reasons that you probably don't even know about today. So I have designed a lecture that will create for you an anticipation that goes into the future and of course includes the past. This was a very difficult lecture for me to put together because although it was all in my head, I didn't have it out on hard copy or anything like that. And I'm going to feed you enough information in the next hour and 15 minutes that's enough to choke a horse and 27 camels. I'm going to move through it really fast, and I don't recommend that you try to make sense of it as I go through, or to remember any details, or to say, I've never heard of this before, therefore I don't know what I'm hearing about. In the end, you will have a bigger picture, though, faint as it may be, that remote viewing is going to see its full appreciation at some point during the next 30 years, maybe even during the next 15 years. You got it? You don't need to worry about whether you understand what I say, because in the end it's all going to come together in your heads. I'm going to cover 9 topics very fast. The last one will be this afternoon, because I don't have time this morning. And after that, this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the research at Stanford that began in 1972 and show you the highlights of that. And at the end, I'm going to show you some very fine examples achieved by what was then my top student at SRI. And after that, I'm going to show you a very fine example of what remote viewing can produce from a friend of mine who I gave a quickie course to in 1996, I think it was, and asked him to come and say a few words about what he experienced. Is that okay for a games plan? Before I go into it, though, I have to remind people of the kind of work that brought me to the attention of so many people, and that work began in late 1970, and by the time I went to SRI in the summer of 72 and later in the autumn of 72, I was already famous. People think that it's my association with SRI that brought this acclaim to me, but in fact it was not SRI. And I think most people have forgotten this earlier kind of research, which I still think is important, not because I did it, but because it reflects a background that I'd already achieved in trying to use perceptions to make sense of what you were seeing without the eyes and the other physical senses. This afternoon you're going to hear what is certainly to be an interesting lecture by Cleve Baxter, and it was in his lab that I really started in New York. He's famous for plant research. At that time he had, well, notorious, I think, because he had hooked his plants up, his lie detectors up to plants, and was seeing that they had emotional responses. And so I met him and said, I'd love to see that. So he brought me to his lab, and I said, who's going to affect the plant? And he said, you are. And so I said, well, gee. So, and then he said, just think of burning this plant's leaf. And I did, and the machine thing just went off the scale, indicating that the plant was responding to my thoughts of harm. I didn't ever burn the plant, and we learned that if the plant figures out that you don't mean it, then it doesn't respond anymore. And that's kind of high-grade consciousness, I think. Anyhow, then Cleve suggested I try to influence bits of metals and gases in little canisters and things, and he set up a number of experiments like that. And I have prepared this little schematic here. You'll see if you put metal in this little canister here, and then it goes into this electric potential detector, and it'll have a typical sine wave on the outprint. It just goes like this, unless something happens that causes its electrical potential to shift. Do you get that? Is that easy enough to understand? And down here are some examples of what happens when the electric potential of the target canister does change. Can you see? And they can be really gross, too. I mean, there's no doubt that the thing is changing its electric potential. This, of course, is a form of psychokinesis, or as it was called back then, PK. And yesterday, Cleve kindly had gone into his diaries back then, and he gave me a list of all the days I came to work in his lab, and it's a whole page filled with his little tiny writing. And so for the first time, I have a record of the days I visited there. I don't have any photographs. I didn't keep any information because I thought this was a lark, working in his lab, and it would be over with in a couple weeks, and I could get back to trying to make my own life. And even when I worked the next 2 years in parapsychology labs, I kept thinking, this isn't going to last, so I'm going to have to, go back to everything. And in fact, my career in laboratories lasted for 19 years and wrecked my life, because my other parts of my life, which I considered valuable and I loved, got short shift because I was always doing something. And it turned out doing something with the CIA, doing something with the Defense Intelligence Agency, going with Puthoff and Targ to the Pentagon, and I would read my lectures and I would berate these people who were supposed to give us money. And, grow up, get smart here, do this. The Russians are doing it, the Soviets are doing it, so you'd better get on the line here. Anyhow, there's a lot of years. Based upon the work in Cleve's lab, Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler, one of the renowned parapsychologists at the time, asked me if I could affect thermistors hidden in thermos bottles. And I said, I have no idea. But Gertrude was so wonderful, I'd try anything for her. You know, she's just terrific. One of the great ladies of parapsychology. And her lab was at City College in New York. And they worked out an experiment. It was proctored by critics ahead of time. And then we sat down to do it. And we did some practice sessions. And here was the layout of the lab. Can you see this? I'll point it out to you. See this little square? That's the desk against which I sat, and Gertrude Schmeidler sat on the other end. And that number 1 is a thermistor hidden in a thermos bottle. And it goes into this great computer who monitors everything that happens in that thermos bottle. In addition to that, there were 5 others. This one was in a separate room. That was in a separate room behind a glass wall. And these were behind me. This one was in 2 barrels, a 5-gallon drum, and another drum inside to make sure that there was no way of touching it. And Gertrude would tell me, okay, now, we'll use number 4, make it hotter or make it colder or don't do anything. And then she would say, now we'll do 5, now we'll do 2, now we'll do 3. And so we did that for over a month. As I remember it. It was in the winter. And she eventually published a paper on it. Well, the word leaked out that it was an entirely successful experiment. And that was the experiment that brought me to mainline media attention anyway, and mainline scientific attention. Why was the... Well, for instance, here is a photograph of me posing behind these cans that appeared in Smithsonian Magazine, which had never in its history published an article or an essay on anything like this. And you see, I didn't have my beard then. I was in my fat period, and I had lowered my head trying to look fierce. And here are these thermistors sealed in these thermos bottles. Isn't that cute? It wasn't long before this experiment got acknowledged in Time magazine. Time magazine went all over the world. My mother and stepfather, who didn't understand what I was doing and thought I should go get a good job, said, well, if it gets in Time magazine, it must be okay. Schmeidler eventually published her article in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. She got that finally together and published in October of '73. And it says that the experiment was an unqualified success, that I did not choose which one I was to influence. She told me which to influence, and then I tried to do it and things like that. Make it hotter or make it colder or don't do anything. The degree of temperature change was very small. Often it was less than a degree, but sometimes it got up to a degree 0.2, which was considered through a continuous experiment where all of the data was considered to be really extraordinary. I thought it was extraordinary by lasting through this. And one of the reasons, or the main reason it was extraordinary, was that parapsychology, for over 40 years by then, had never been able to produce a repeatable experiment. And the critics and the skeptics says if it's not repeatable, then it doesn't exist. It can't be called science, and so forth and so on. And this was so important to the degree at the time that many parapsychologists said that psychic effects cannot be repeated. They're just never going to be repeated because they're singular little events in themselves and you can't repeat it. So I broke through that threshold with Gertrude Schmeidler. This was her idea, so it was her breakthrough, that actually, if you sort of have an idea what you're doing, you can repeat something. Now, I have to ask you, with regard to remote viewing, if you can't repeat remote viewing, what good is it? I mean, so you have a spectacular remote viewing session at one point, and then you never see another one from that person. Right, Russell? So repeatability became a big, big sales word in what was to be the future of remote viewing, which we didn't think had a future back then. At the same time, I was working in Cleve Baxter's lab, and with Gertrude Schmeidler, I was invited to come and do experiments at the American Society for Psychical Research. And what they had going there at the time was, under Dr. Osis and Dr. Janet Mitchell, an experiment where a target was hanging on a tray from a 15-foot ceiling so high that you couldn't get up to it or even touch it and things, and you were to sit over here, you were to be hooked up to a brainwave detector, brainwave thing and everything, and you were supposed to, quote, float up out of your body and look down on the tray and tell us what you see in an out-of-body state. I said, well, I'll try it, because they'd offered to pay me $45 a visit. And you remember in 1972, that was good money back then. Okay, let me get to these slides. Well, was the importance of the Schmeidler experiment. Here's lovely Janet Mitchell, one of the most greatest people I have ever met in my life. She was a stickler for accuracy. She kept notes. Everything was in order at the ASPR that was under her charge. And I'm going to show you some other pictures of disorder under other people's charge. And she ran these brainwave machines, which were in this had been an old townhouse, and this room would have been the master bedroom. And it had been divided in half. The ceilings were 15 feet high. So there were two chambers then, and the brainwave machine was in this chamber here. And the wires to the brainwave machine went through the wall in back of this. This is an early Beckman Dynograph brainwave recorder, and went into the experimental chamber. And here's Janet hooking me up. You see, I'm in my fat period. And I hate to show this slide, but what can you do? It's history now. So Janet's hooking me up. And here's the target tray. You see it's up there near the ceiling. And on this side there's a target, and on that side there's a target. And I said, why can't there be just one target? They said, well, we want to know if you can see this one in your floating up out-of-body state, and then you have to move around the partition and see the one on the other side. So here were my responses to one day to the two targets, you see. And over here there's this little circle with showing lines. That's supposed to be the places where I thought I was out of my body looking at these targets, you know. Here was the left target on the left, for which I just had drawn an X and identified it as black and white. And here was a target on the south side, which is on blue paper, just simple cutouts. You know, I mean, people's idea of targets are really idiotic. Well, I had drawn these, and I correctly identified the colors for one of the only few times in my life, by the way. So here I am sitting beneath the target trays. Got it? And I couldn't move. If I moved my neck, it put artifacts into the brainwave machine, and the needles went all over the place. Here was one day where I was trying to see what this target was, and I drew this here and I drew this there and everything, and I said, this is letters of some kind, and it may be Arabic letters. This turned out to be a very important experiment, because here was the target tray. And you didn't get these numbers, didn't get that, didn't get this, didn't get that, and I thought it didn't get that either. And when Dr. Osis saw the result, he came running downstairs from his office. He says, you got it, you got it. Just turn your response upside down, and there it is. Well, this came as a complete shock to me. Because I did not do this consciously. This was pre-conscious processes, and this was coming from some autonomic response inside of me, completely bypassing consciousness stuff. And this was the first time I realized, if that's the case, then this must be part of our species inheritance. And the implication was that we all have this capability somewhere in us. Our minds can be conditioned to become different, as we all know that. But our inner systems that are doing perception at some other level beneath our consciousness must be there. And this is what really began to get me interested, because I did not want to be a super psychic. First of all, there wasn't enough money in it. And I wanted to get back to my paintings and writing a good novel that would make it bestseller. Anyhow, I got interested in this, and of course this is the secret of the universe here, in a way. Here are other targets that I show you. This one down here is pretty good. I got that as a target shape, and I got the slice of pie out of it and everything. But I got the colors wrong. When I looked at this target up here, I said, well, I can see the heart is a big red thing, but if I was to look at this in real life, I wouldn't know what it was. Can you tell me what that is? No, it's a holder for a letter opener. And I said, well, why does a letter opener need a holder? Anyway. Anyhow, I have this machine here. I'm machining. Other experiments we did, this was the same setup in Dr. Osa's office on the 4th floor, and this was called the fly-in experiment. You were supposed to fly into his office, and then you were supposed to do the same thing. Did you get that one? Fly in. I mean, here was a brightness comparator machine that somebody invented there. You see this disc here? And these dials here, it was a complicated thing that could be randomized and made automatic, and it would turn this bright, medium, or dim. And the thing that you were looking at was in another room, so you had a wall between you, so you were supposed to say, they would say, okay, and then you were supposed to go into the other room and see if this was bright, medium, or dim. So that was the brightness comparator experiment. Here's another one. This is not Janet Mitchell's lab. You can believe that. His name was Merriweather. He was a physicist there. This was the perceptual box, and that had wheels inside, and it could turn and so forth and so on, and they could put different targets on the wheel, and you were supposed to go and peer through this little black opening down there between the two arrows and say what was in the upper left quadrant, what color was in this quadrant, and I finally said, well, I can't tell you the quadrants because I don't know where the floor is. I don't know which is up and down in this state. So somebody put these nice white arrows to show you where the floor was. So well, people are grasping for good experiments, And inside were little wheels like this, which would spin around, and they would have colors on them, and they would have symbols on them, and you were supposed to say what the symbol was, and then you were supposed to say what color the symbol was, and then you were supposed to identify what color the background was in this quadrant. And if you got one of the other quadrants, it was considered a miss. So that was called the revolving disc experiment. So at the ASPR experiments in 1971, this is sort of the list of what I worked with. Out-of-body perception, fly-in perception, the color wheel perception, symbols and numbers perception, which was a bust, by the way, brightness comparator, that silly little thing, perceptual box with its whirly-gig things inside, the revolving disc with its the outbound experimenter, where somebody went to a location at a given time. I'm sitting in this lab and I was supposed to spy on them over distance and say where they were. We did 5 of those. And then I got so bored, I said, you know, we have to do something that I think is more interesting. Why don't I go a long distance? And we figured out that I could go someplace that Janet Mitchell directed, a city, and tell what the weather was, or try to. And then she could call up the local weather place and find out what the weather was doing. That's a very simple experiment, and all you ostensible remote viewers should try this, because it's a beginning of trying to use your faculties for just learning about your own faculties rather than trying to find something that will astonish the world. The last 2 experiments, outbound experimenter and the distant weather thing, were the first beginnings of what became called remote viewing. So they're sort of very important. At the ASPR, in that 1 year, we totaled up towards the end of the year, and I had done 200,000 trials in these various experiments. Now, all of you should try to do 200,000 trials in these experiments, because it will give you some idea of what's going on in you, how easy these things are or how difficult. When I went to SRI, we started doing thousands and thousands of trials, and we were keeping count of them up until the middle of 1975, when we reached 500,000. And then we decided it was just too laborious to count anymore. So there's 250,000 trials, 750,000 trials that all of you should attempt yourselves. Set up some of these little experiments here. Not only did I become well known and media attention for many years because of this, but I became a walking analysis factory of my own internal perceptions. And every remote viewer should do practice sessions of some of these kinds and just practice the heck out of everything, you know. You can set up really fun things. The distant weather experiment was great because you could have immediate feedback. So this is why I became famous. And later on, I became infamous for working with the CIA. And later on, it became classified, so I couldn't talk about it anymore. And later on, everybody forgot about me because of that. And it's only been resuscitated and revitalized here in these last few years. Now, I've probably taken too much time on this here, and we'll go now to the information that's going to choke you in the horses and things like that, because I wanted to build a larger overview of remote viewing based on 30 years past and 30 years ahead. Do any of you here realize why there is a 30 years ahead type of thing? No? This conference isn't going to project a future for 30 years ahead. I'm sorry to say. It's a great conference, but you have to have more than a bunch of kooks coming to a conference to. Yes, ma'am. I can't hear you.
Because the past, present, and future all exist at the same time?
No, not quite. So, I have a fresh audience here to Mind Program, right? Yes, ma'am.
Maybe because of our intentions, of what we see.
Could be, could be. Okay. Here, look at this now.
That looks pretty good, Ingo.
What? And I checked these slides 5 times. Okay. I see what I did. During the next 30 years, remote viewing must be considered in the light of important advances in the conventional sciences that are contributing to increases of understanding of human subtle powers. Do you know what's going on in the conventional sciences? They don't call it ESP. They don't call it psychic. They're never going to call it psychic. But I'm going to demonstrate today that there's a huge groundswell of interest in how human perceptions work and what is possible with the human. Before I do that, I'm going to retreat back to... I'm not either. Let's see. Dang. All right. This is a big lecture. You see, these are my teleprompter notes. And it's hard for me to keep it all in my mind, so that's why I have these things here. What do we mean by the contemporary conventional sciences? I'm going to read you a list. Electrochemical physiology is discovering things about our subtle perceptions. Neurobiology, neurophysiology, and neuropsychology is discovering things about our subtle perceptions. Bioradiation studies is doing the same thing. Hormone and hormonal transmission research is doing the same thing. Chemical signal research is still doing the same thing. And they're miles ahead of all you here, and they're miles ahead of the remote viewing community, but they don't call it those words. Bioelectric research, do you know that goes on? Brainwave research, advanced brainwave research. Biosensitivity research, these are all legitimate fields in the conventional sciences, and they're all working on subtle perceptions. Bioelectric information transfer research. Sensory coding research. That's really fun if you get into it. Biomagnetic navigation. Biomagnetic navigation research. That's how people can find their way around when they don't have a compass, right? Bioelectronic systems research. That's how your biological electric systems are working to amass data coming from all sorts of places. Electrophysiological studies. Multi-stability in perception research. Pheromone and pheromone transfer research. You all know what pheromones are? Sexual attraction, right? we put them, do you know where we exude our pheromones from? Our armpits. Sniff around. Subliminal perception research. Well, that's an old thing, but it's making great headways. Neuromagnetic response research. Do you know that our systems will respond to magnets? Yeah. Bioinfrared and bio-ultraviolet perception research. All of these things that I've read in English could be subsumed under the formal research that went in the Soviet Union called biocommunications and bioinformation transfer. Because of all of these conventional sciences working on these fields, their data is interconnectable, and there's a big picture building, and this big picture is so important that in the next 30 years it's going to replace the past scientific concepts of what the human being is and result in a new science superstructure being formatted that's not based on the 5 physical senses or anything like that in the past. Does anybody here agree with me? You all know this. Russell? Russell's nodding. Approval. Right now, the most important approaches to remote viewing and things like that are information theory applied to human nervous systems. This is the most significant thing that's taking place. There are also subliminal processes being studied, and subtle energies and information flows are being studied by many, many, many scientists, including Dr. William Tiller, whom I hope would come here next year and address you all. Advanced brainwave studies, especially in Canada, where Dr. Michael Persinger has located and identified several brainwave signatures that identify whether you're having a real perception of a distant object or whether it's just imagination. And he can tell in advance of seeing the target which of your perceptions will go with the target. Is that not advancing? Yeah. I worked with him for 2 summers for 10 days each, and it's amazing. Just totally, totally amazing. And he thinks I have a brain that should be put in a jar and pickled for future study. Said I'd much rather have my genetic structure mapped, and he said, we can't afford that, but we can afford the pickle. Also, ongoing discoveries of sensory receptors. I'll talk about this a little later. And cybernetics and design of intelligent machines. People want to invent intelligence machines, and they need a model as to how intelligence works. So guess what they've chosen as the model? You and you and you. So they find out how this is working in humans, so they can build a machine that does it. But the byproduct is they find out how humans are working for the first time in history, you know. So awareness, let's see, I messed a page up here. Advances in the conventional sciences are increasingly confirming the real existence of subtle receptors and extensive senses beyond the 5 physical sensing organs. And this is what's going to make remote viewing credible in the next 30 years. Or this is one of the things. Would you agree, Russell? Yes. Advances in those areas are increasing understanding that subtle and ultra-subtle sensing systems are a full part of what? What are they a full part of? Of humans, yes. Of our species. These things belong to our species. You know, we can get born, we can be mind programmed to think this way or that and everything. Part of the mind programming says don't use these special things. You might become a telepath and find out everybody's secrets. So, you know, close that down at least, and so forth and so on. But now, the consensus is say, hey, we have a species here which is more fabulous than we've ever thought. And that includes all of you too here. These advances predict an increase of understanding that remote viewing is possible. The combined advances predict a future changing convergence of a new scientific reality about the fuller spectrum of subtle human sensing systems. The convergence slowly began in the 1950s, believe it or not. That's a little while ago, and is continuing and is now continuing and accelerating, but its bigger picture outlines have not yet trickled down to general appreciation. This is why I'm doing this lecture, so you can generally appreciate it, trickle down a little bit. So it is difficult to place remote viewing in its contexts. But the thing is, I want to point out that remote viewing is shortly to be considered a species phenomenon, not a phenomenon of given individuals. And if it's considered a species phenomenon, there's going to be a lot of people who want to develop it, because it's developable, okay? At any rate, this hasn't really trickled down yet, so remote viewing is still judged on the merits or demerits of its own evidence, right? We have to see an example of remote viewing out here, and then we judge it whether it's good or not. We're not judging it by the fact that it's innate in us. We're judging it by something outside of us. And so it's judged on its own evidence. All of us produce little things that say this is remote viewing, and people look at it and they judge it and things, and it either falls or succeeds on its own evidence, and nobody thinks past this point. They don't think past the mind that produced it, or the other minds that can produce it. They haven't quite locked that up yet. So remote viewing is judged piece by piece on its own externalized evidence, and not on the amazing extensive awarenesses of our subtle sensing systems. So did you get that, how we judge remote viewing? I mean, nobody can just come up and say I'm a remote viewer because I have subtle sensing systems. Everybody will say, so do one, show me. Right? So he puts a piece of paper into the physical universe, and everybody looks at this and says, oh, yeah, one way or the other. And they don't enter into this guy's mind to see if he is really a remote viewer. So this is the way we still judge remote viewing, and because of this, what we see of evidence is what emerges from some few individuals. Some people can do it, other people can't. So the assumption follows that remote viewing refers to some special skills that some have but others do not have. Right? Well, it's right. Just talk to the skeptics. They'll tell you, none of you have it. So then some special guy comes along and gets hired by the CIA, and they say, he has it, but the rest of you don't have it. Anyhow, there's a major problem with this assumption that it belongs to just a few people, because evidence of remote viewing or something like it has been reported for over 2,000 years. And this implies that remote viewing potentials are downloading from the species level through the generations. Every time you have a family and children, you are sending forth the same factors that could result in remote viewing or telepathy. They just don't get developed in these children. You know, you have to nurture things to get them developed, and we don't have that nurturing. In the past, shamans of the Russian steppes, Mongolia, Tibet, and among sages of all forms of Eastern mystics, things like remote viewing were taken for granted and nurtured. You know what the Aborigines of Australia do? They sit around fires all the time, time tripping, space tripping, going everywhere. That's what they do. Wise men and women of ancient and even modern Africa, there's a lot of African cultures that have things like remote viewing and things like influencing things by intention and things like that. There are traditions in Mexico and Peru. The shamans of the American Indians. Are there any American Indians here? Well, they're really hot on this kind of stuff, you know. Do you know a good Indian we have receptors for heat sensing in our palms. Did you know that? Magnetic heat sensing. And a good Indian can hold his hand up and say, yeah, the enemy's over there. I can feel their fires in my hand. This is true, and it works. And are any of you familiar with the kahunas and huna codes of Hawaii? Boy, there's something that everybody should read about. But I'm going to focus on Patanjali. Russell mentioned him this morning. This is the version of the translation of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by Swami Satchidananda. And there's several versions of these translations. It's hard to translate Sanskrit into English, so there are many difficulties and differences of opinions about what Patanjali actually said. One thing about these sutras is they're descended out of far older sources and probably date back 9,000 years. They could easily do that. And today, these same sutras remain the principal foundations of all existing systems of yoga. Did you know that? Everything is derived from this one book. And I'm tripping on wires. The sutras are the most complete description of the science of mind management and self-inquiry that has survived from the Indo-Aryan pool of knowledge. This book is really a nice translation because of Satchidananda's commentaries that follow through it. So if you're interested in the sutras, you should try to get this. It's easily available. Okay, a sutra the term sutra in Sanskrit literally means thread. You know what a thread is? Threads things together. Patanjali uses it to designate a line of thought, or thoughts that should be organized and connected. If you can't organize your thoughts, what good are they? How can you learn a language if you can't organize your thoughts about it? Connect it with threads of thoughts. In the sutras, there are 195 sutras, and they're divided into 4 chapters, books, or sections. The section 3 is called the Vibhuti Pada, which is usually translated as attainments or siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I-S. Satchidananda indicates throughout his translation that the sutras apply to training the mind. If you can't train the mind, what can you do? I mean, we can train the mind. I mean, we can program the mind. Are your minds programmed? Yeah, mine was programmed, and I believed everything when I was a kid that was put into it. Whose minds here are not programmed? I shouldn't ask these questions. Okay, slide coming up. Siddhi, from the Sanskrit verb sid, to attain or attainment. How do you attain something? Attain, to arrive at by motion, growth, or effort. To achieve, acquire, or obtain. To develop into a finished state. So we have a package of information such as the language, and then you have to work on it to put it all in order, and eventually you end up with a vocabulary of 17,000 words, and you can talk and you can communicate, right? Okay, you have a mind that can remote view, but unless you know what to put in order, you don't end up with the equivalent of a 17,000 word vocabulary for remote viewing, so your remote viewing isn't very good. So you have to find out what it is. If you're going to practice telepathy, what do you have to do? You have to find out that there are 35 kinds of telepathy, according to me, first. And then you have to select which kind you want to work with. Which kind would you like to work with? The kind that gets the lotto. Right? Patanjali describes a superpower that's sometimes referred to as buchari, the ability of distant seeing and literally translated to fly over the earth. Remote viewing under this other context was being discussed at 200 to 300 BC. Okay, this buchari is one of them. Here I've put, there are a number of cities, there's usually 6 or 8 that are usually discussed, and I put them in this left-hand category, and over here I've tried to put the modern terms in them. The city, that means the power too, and in modern terms we simply call it paranormal. And did you know that when anything extraordinary happens, in the 20th century anyway, it was just called paranormal? That's not quite fair, is it? Because the normal meant that it was lesser than the paranormal. Anyhow, to rise from the ground, we now call levitation. Distant seeing, used to be called traveling clairvoyance. Enter body and mind of another, we call that body-mind telepathy. Fly in the sky, that's an out-of-body experience. Know of past, present, and future. Parapsychology calls that pre- or post-cognition. To acquire hidden treasures, goal-directed clairvoyance, we would call that. Have everybody tried to locate a treasure? Did you find it? Ah, she found it. Want to talk to you. There's a city called Conquest of Death. The best of, I can guess, is clinical death experience. And then there's the power to die at will. Since we wouldn't think of doing that in our culture, we don't even have a term for it. Well, that's not what Patanjali had in mind, you know. I think he had just turning off the circuits, you know, without doing something. Okay, so we have buchari. These are synonyms now for remote viewing. Buchari, earth flying, distant seeing, traveling clairvoyance, and remote viewing. And I don't even know where I am in my notes. I get so carried away. Well. So if we say we're going to train remote viewing, why don't we say we're going to train buchari? And in fact, you can't train a word. Can you train a word? No, you have to train what's behind the word, what it refers to. And all these 5 local past and present references all refer to the same thing within us. So we can't say we're going to train remote viewing, right? We're going to train something in us that can produce remote viewing, or produce distant seeing, or give the thrill of what? Have any of you here done a remote viewing? Tried? Were you thrilled in any way? Oh. Well. So, we just finished. You can't train a word. So what can be trained? Where am I, for God's sakes? Well, where we are is at the end of where we are. I'm sorry to make a mess of this. It's too big of an effort. So what is the basic context of training and attainment? Do you know what it is? Did you ever read the dictionary? I hate to always tell people, why don't you look these words up in the dictionary? Paul? Did I ever make you look up a word in a dictionary?
I hate dictionaries.
Okay, from the dictionary, training, order designed to lead to some result. A connected series as of thoughts. Sutras, right? To form by instruction, discipline, or skill. Paul?
Yes.
Were you ever subjected to discipline?
Do you want to see my stripes?
Reduce it all to physical stuff right away.
No, it was,
Mental discipline, Paul. The basic context of training to create an ordered mind map of all involved so that awareness and intelligence can respond to the order. You like that? Were you tutored to do that?
absolutely. I've become so linear,
I wouldn't brag about the linear part. Human systems responding to the order with skill equals attainment. And attainment is a siddhi. Over 2,000 years ago, an attainment was called a siddhi. And we now know from a dictionary that you can look up these words and you can say, okay, let's put an ordered frame of reference here, and we can train the ordered frame of reference. We're not training the ability or the skill. We're only introducing an ordered frame of reference, and then the ability or skill will follow. If everything is random, you can't do anything because it's always random, right? Moving on to the next big section here. Receptors and sensing systems. Does anybody here know what a receptor is? Help me out. Oh, yeah. Those are called organs, by the way. Here are the organs. Eyes, ears, taste, blah, blah, blah. The human with 5 physical sensing organs. Y'all believe that? Remote viewing doesn't fit in there. You better not believe it. There's no place in here for remote viewing, and the skeptics used to say, it doesn't exist, it doesn't fit here. This book came out in 1984, and I wish we'd have had it during the 70s at SRI. But here is Deciphering the Senses. You should, if you're all buying books, you should try to get a copy of this book. This is the first book format that I found that brings together all of the original work on receptors, which increases our sensing systems to 17 rather than just 5. And it's a very, very wonderful book. And this is the first conventional book reporting on sciences that devotes its last chapter to the resuscitation of parapsychology and what is studied in parapsychology. So it's actually a bridge between the hardcore sciences and parapsychology. Have any of you read it? Gosh. I only have 30 minutes? Get lost. A receptor. Here's what a receptor is. Some kind of nerve end cell, cellular group, synapse, neural pathway, or network that detects information bits and forwards them into the central sensing systems and brain. Right? How many cells do you have in your body? Trillions. They're all receptors of some kind. The nerve endings are busy picking up little information tidbits. So here's what, I have to try to illustrate these. Here's what the human system actually looks like. Did I leave off one? I did. Anyway, so now you see the whole body is peppered. Each of these little dots are 10 trillion receptors. This is what you are. You're a walking receptor machine of millions and millions of receptors. And you're trained only to use the 5 physical. Have you not been trained that way? Here are some receptors that have been identified that support remote viewing. Oh, I don't have a slide for it. Sorry. Okay, here's some receptor systems that have been identified and are in the books and in the scientific literature. Skin receptors that detect balance and imbalance of what is external to the body, even at great distances. You're looking at yonder barn out there, and your systems say, it's going to fall over pretty soon. Right? Simple little things like that. Farmers have that. Another kind, a distance directional finding and locating receptors in the endocrine and neuropeptide systems. You don't need a compass, in other words. If these receptors in your mind programming included these, you could cross the ocean. You wouldn't need anything else. You know where to go. Another kind, neurological receptors for interpreting modulated electronic information by converting it into analog signal and mental storage, interpretation, and cognition. Did you figure all that out? You don't need to. You only need to know that something like that's going on. Receptors, you know where the pineal gland is? Come on, we have New Age types here, don't we? The pineal gland is in the middle of your head. It's about the size of a pea. Receptors in the pineal gland that detect solar and lunar rhythms, solar flares, and sunspots. Your pineal is detecting them even if you're oblivious consciously, okay? The pineal senses forthcoming tidal forces of Earth, Moon, and Sun. They sense actual and forthcoming storms and earthquakes. So if you can sense earthquakes coming, your pineal gland is doing that. Did you know that? I didn't know that. This came like a bolt out of the blue when I found it. The pineal receptors act as non-visual photoreceptors. This is what we would call in more common terms X-ray vision. The pineal gland can see everything, apparently. Did you know that? Yeah, there's pee in your brain. They can see everything. It's important to know that because that's an aspect of remote viewing, right? So our receptor systems are sending millions and millions of signals to our brain. Okay, we know that now. Science knows this. These conventional fields know this. Millions and millions of subtle signals to our brain are coming into our brain. Most of those signals do not make it into awareness and perception. Why? Can you tell me? Can you tell me? Pardon? Program. Oh, I love you. I love you. Yeah, you're programmed to receive only certain kinds of information packages and not other ones. Okay? This is a simple thing that could be corrected if you knew how to do it. And we should all find that out. Here's Science News of 11 December 1999. There's an article in it called Joined at the Senses. Here it is, Joined at the Senses. Perception may feast on a sensory show, not a 5-cent buffet. They now we don't even call them senses anymore, we just call them buffets. It's by Jeff Brower. This article reports on investigations that light the way toward a solution of the fundamental mysteries of how the brain unites separate sensations into multifaceted experiences. The brain somehow assembles separate sensations into reasonable approximation of what is being sensed. You all tried remote viewing here? Have you tried to assemble a reasonable approximation of what's being sensed? You did or didn't you? Yeah. Did you succeed? Groping in the dark, right? Interactions across sensory receiving areas in the cortex may be more widespread than previously suspected. The article argues that it's time to drop the assumption that people perceive the world through separate sensory channels of the five senses only. This is a first-class science magazine, and they published an article say let's jettison the five senses only thing. Earlier on, this is from Science News, by the way, of September 29th, 2001. Earlier on, this same Bruce Brower published an article in Science News that reviewed clinical evidence that minds may track danger unconsciously. Do you all track danger unconsciously? Have any of you had a premonition in your life? Yeah, there it is. It's now known that brains do this. Brains do it. The autonomic nervous system does it. Whether it gets into frontal cortex consciousness or not is another matter. You should invite this guy next year to your conference, because he seems to be the Science News guy that's on top of what's going on in these areas. Look at the next title. Oh. How do you conceptualize remote viewing? Is it little pictures, the one your ego likes, or is there a bigger picture? Do you think there's bigger pictures? Let me show you one. Well, first of all, we have to figure out what a bigger picture is. What is a bigger picture? Speak up.
Larger amounts of information.
Yeah, that's good. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you might be seeing something, but then you figure out maybe where it's enlarged.
Oh, maybe.
Or what it's about.
Yeah, bigger picture, you know. Well, what's a smaller picture? Okay, we can just pass on. There it is. Bigger picture. The best definition, the largest scope of data, information, and knowledge. So what's a smaller picture? A smaller picture equals diminished scope of information. So do you know people that have smaller pictures? What does scope mean?
Things in relation to other things.
Yeah, okay. Scope. Anybody know what scope means? Scope, taken from the basic idea of to watch, to look at. Opportunity or space for unhampered thought, motion, or activity. Weren't you discussing this morning, Russell, in your still pond thing?
Timeless awareness.
Timeless awareness, well, more or less. Extent of influence, treatment, or activity. Range of operation. Is anybody here familiar with the range of operation of their own thinking systems? I know in my range that I'm not going to sweep floors. We know, most of us know, what we can do or what we've been taught to do, and that's about it, right? It's unfortunate. Increase of scope depends on organized data becoming organized information, becoming organized knowledge. All you have to do is increase your knowledge scope. Decrease of scope depends on data, information, knowledge, vacuums. Here you have this marvelous system that you're born with, which is filled with information vacuums, and these prevent formative awareness. The title of this lecture was announced as remote viewing, viewed from the outside or the inside. Did any of you know what that meant? I like to befuddle people. The outside, what is it? Quick, participate, audience.
Expansive awareness.
Yeah. the outside is everything within and beyond self, right? And the scope of the 5 physical senses. The 5 physical senses are really keep us in a certain area of the electromagnetic spectrum and our environment where we are. That's all they're good for, by the way. So let's see. Okay, let me ask you a question. Are intuition, telepathy, clairvoyance, ESP, remote viewing on the outside? Where are they? Well, they're not on the outside. The inside, what is it?
It's our own internal universe.
Is it a universe? Maybe it's merely a small, insignificant speck in that universe. You know, I mean, to say we have universes in us is, I think, getting a little egocentric. All right, let me familiarize you with your inside a little bit. You see this oval here? Okay. Can you close your eyes? Make an image of that oval. Did you all do that? Did anybody not do it? You all did it. Okay, with your eyes closed, turn that oval red. Did you do that? Turn it blue. Now, turn it yellow. How did you do this? Do you know how you're doing that?
Remembering, intention.
You don't know how you're doing that. Nobody knows how you're doing that. Did you know that science has no idea about how that's done? It's just done. Okay? So you've put labels on it, you're doing it in your own little universe, or your own little dirty spot. Close your eyes again, recreate this low oval here. Did you do that? Put the face of the person you hate the most in it. Did you do that? Oh. Well, put the picture of the person you love the most in it then. How did you do that? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So, does the remote viewer have an outside and an inside? Do any of you know what the inside is like? Composed of? Here is our intrepid remote viewer. Here's what the intrepid remote viewer usually focuses on. The outside things and phenomena, right? Outside of him. In fact, all remote viewing that I know about is explained in terms of outsideness. He got the target, he didn't get the target. The target was this, the target wasn't that, you know. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, we don't know what the processes are that did all this, but we know that this is the outside part of it. Comfortable with this outside here? I mean, there are things on the outside to really like, but it doesn't explain anything about the inside. What happens during a remote viewing session? In 5 words.
Inside connects with the outside.
Pardon?
Inside connects with the outside.
Inside connects with the outside. Yeah, I'll do that. That's okay. You expand your awareness? What is it you're expanding? The awareness is just a label for something, you know. Russell. We've had this discussion before, I think. Okay, what happens during a remote viewing session? Information from or about a distant location or target is somehow input into the mind of the viewer, after which the viewer outputs, blah, 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 whatever the information has been sensed or perceived. Did you get that? Okay, here's an effort to put what I just said into a little diagram. There's the intrepid remote viewer. There's a distant side over there. Some kind of signals or something are coming, you know, they get into the inside. See the hole? You have to have a hole in your head to do this. So then the viewer starts projecting to the outside descriptions, blah, 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 drawing sketches, three-dimensional clay models. Have you ever seen a three-dimensional clay model of a remote viewing session?
Yeah.
Oh, you did? Where? Helen made some, yeah, I know she did. I'm going to show you some later today. You see what happens? That's what's going on. Here's an even better picture where we finally see the inside. You see the inside? We don't know if the inside is inside, but it's not the outside. We know it's not the outside. You know, you have to sort of weaken everybody's boundaries about these identities, and you can see that, you know, in fact, everything that you perceive is inside. You're not even perceiving what's outside. You're perceiving what the simulation that your brain and thing is making of the outside. We're all insiders, according to that. Okay, so the simple formula of what happens during a remote viewing session. Where the hell did you go? Oh, I don't have that on a slide. The simple formula is what happens in a remote viewing session is information input versus information output. Okay? We can think, because the conventional sciences say so, that we may, in remote viewing, be getting 100% of the information about a distant target. Are we outputting 100%? Okay, so there are some complications. Where are the complications? The complications are because the inside has very complex computational systems. Many of the inside systems have been mapped and identified via conventional research, perception, consciousness, and information theories. And this results in three bigger pictures of remote viewing. Here's one. I'm racing to keep up with the time element here. The first bigger picture of remote viewing involves a fuller spectrum of human sensing systems. Did you know we may have sensing systems that have never even been identified? I know that. You all wouldn't be here unless you knew that too. Is that right? Somehow. It involves cognitive perception. Sometimes you fail to understand what you see? And what do you do then? You forget about it as soon as possible. And the third bigger picture is information transfer. Russell mentioned this morning. Okay, there's now an even bigger complication because there are more bigger pictures. One of the biggest complications is that the individual remote viewer is the instrument of human sensing systems, information transfer, and cognitive perception. Did you know you're an instrument for all this? Am I overwhelming you? You don't need to have any of this in mind, you know, just sit here and doze off if you want. You're going to get it anyway. Have any of you read this book, The User Illusion? This is the top book that you should be reading, everybody. Have you read it, Russell? Okay, this is from Denmark. And in this book you will find, it's called The User Illusion, Cutting Consciousness Down to Size, which is a terrible title, by the way, so don't pay any attention to it. During any given second, we consciously process only 16 of the 11 million bits of information our senses pass on to our brains. Did you know that? I fell out of bed when I read this. I mean, 16 out of 11 million, that's... In other words, the conscious part of us receives much less information than the unconscious part of us. That's an understatement, right? We should trust, and this book says, we should trust our hunches and pursue our intuitions because they are closely related to reality than perceived reality of consciousness. Isn't that wonderful? This book was a bestseller in Europe. Didn't quite make it here in the United States, but if you're going to spend money on books over the next year, you should buy this. It's still available in bookstores. It's a little hard read, but just read 3 words at a time and you'll get the picture. You, as an instrument of remote viewing, a potential one, possess a bandwidth of consciousness that is much smaller than the sensing systems are. Your perceptual cortex needs at least 1/2 second of stimulation to achieve awareness. So if something doesn't last 1/2 seconds, you're not going to perceive it. You know? I mean, sex drives are like that. They don't last very long, so you might miss a lot of them. I hate to get back to that, but that's a common denominator, you know. Subliminal and preconscious processes that seldom become conscious. You have an estimate 10,000 information processing systems that never have become conscious in you, or me either, for that matter. You see, I feel inferior when I read things like this, you know. Here, you know, it's okay. You have an attention capacity that needs to oscillate at 40 hertz in order to recognize anything. So if your cortex is not going at 40 hertz somewhere around here, things like that, you might not recognize anything that's coming into your systems here. I'll clarify this all a little later. We'll move on now to the greatest difficulty. Each remote viewing instrument, that is all of us here, possesses developed reality patterns or reality boxes that work to determine what is or is not perceived. And didn't the lady over here point this out earlier? Your reality box may be preventing you from getting into all of this information that is going to make you a superb remote viewer. To get a grip, the psychological and parapsychology concepts that are utilized in research explain remote sensing and remote viewing. Here's the psychology one. The study of mind and the study of normal and abnormal mental and behavioral characteristics of an individual or group. Are you familiar with that one? See, when our sensing systems, some of them are labeled paranormal or abnormal, we don't want to have them. It puts us out of phase with our peer groups. Parapsychology, the field which uses the scientific method to investigate phenomena for which there appear to be no normal explanations. Right? So, one thing that's going to disappear, and has already begun to disappear, is the blasphemy of abnormal in this new science thing coming up, which is beginning to explain everything, you know, about how we can perceive so much. The 20th century activities and mindsets like this are just going to vanish. And I think they've already started to do that. See, I had slides for all these. Paranormal, normal perception, paranormal perception. I'll go back to that. Normal perception. Mental cognition processes in response to an external event or source that has presented itself to any of the 5 physical senses. Okay? Paranormal perception. Mental cognition processes in response to an external event or source that has not presented itself to any of the 5 physical senses. This is remote viewing, for one thing, right? Paul?
Yes, absolutely right.
Okay. This is also intuition, telepathy, clairvoyance, ESP, and of course remote viewing. I have now to really hit you over the head with one difficult to understand. A basic distinction between parapsychology theory and information theory. Does everybody have that at their fingertips? Parapsychology theory sets up categories of phenomena and tries to measure them via their apparent statistical behavior. Have any of you ever undergone that? I have. 250,000 trials of it. They weren't interested in me, they were interested in the behavior of the phenomena over there. Okay, I'm going to throw one at you just to liven you up. What do intuition, telepathy, clairvoyance, ESP, and remote viewing have in common? Yes, sir.
Mr. Swann, sir, I believe they're all part of the higher functioning of the mind.
Uh-huh. But what do they have exactly in common?
They all process information.
Oh, I love you. Stand up. Would you stand up? There you go. They all perceive and process information. And they are part of what we would call the higher function, but maybe they're normal functions, you know. And anyhow, they all perceive and process information. So, in essence, there's no difference between them in terms of what they do. How they do it might be a little different, you know. It takes different kinds of things to invade somebody's mind than it does somebody's silo. Okay, when we talk about information, when we talk about information theory, we're talking about information theory applied to the human nervous system. Information theory does not refer to meaning or information. It refers to the ease or difficulty of sending, receiving available information through channels that can be processed and measured in bits per second. Every remote viewing example that anybody's ever produced can be reassessed through the bits of information per second that came through the channel, right? We don't need to think of it in any other way. And the information theory aspect of this is very important because when I went to SRI, Dr. Putoff beat me up until I agreed to follow information theory. Don't tell him that, but he really made a big case for it. Okay, parapsychology, seen as different qualitative and quantitative behavioral phenomena. Can you read that? I don't know if you can read it. Information theory is seen as bit per second information receiving plus cognitive awareness. Do you see the difference? Think. It's easy. It's easy. In between are intuition, telepathy, clairvoyance, ESP, and remote viewing. So you assess them via the parapsychology model, and you don't get very far because you're not dealing with what the five are actually doing. They're transferring information of some kind. So you have to put, if you understand that, then you have to take the model, begin working with the model of information theory. Are you all of the impression that there's a new future out there because of all of this? Huh? Now, how much time do I have? Nobody's wandered by with a little sign lately. 5 minutes. Okay. I'm going to skip a few things here because I don't think we need them. Because I sense you're all beginning to absorb what I'm talking about a little bit. Oh, here. I shouldn't pass this up. We're only getting 16 bits per second out of 11 million that are coming into our consciousness. You see all this out here? You see this little glowing thing here, which we consider so valuable, ourselves? You're only getting 40 bits. Well, this is the model that should now be on the front door of every remote viewing installation in the world. This is what you have to deal with. I'm right up to snuff here. Some systems and processes of the inside. Do you know of any systems and processes of the inside? I won't embarrass you any further. Okay, this is a general idea. Objects we experience, this is the eyeball one. The eyeball, you see it, objects we experience seeing, and then we think that it goes directly into reflected images of subjects somewhere in the brain. This is called the movie screen idea, right? I know science magazines that are still pumping this, even though this has been known to be incorrect for 15 years. See, so this is the eye as a camera. So we would think of all of our receptors as cameras a little bit. Okay, but it's not that straightforward. Here is more likely what goes on. Okay, here's the outside. Visible light waves, frequencies reflecting from objects, they're going into the eye system. Do you see that? I'm getting into my Hindu twang here. And so the eye converts these to electrical signals and pulses. You see them? And then they meet the subconscious processes, filter and reformat the signals into a reconstructed simulation of what's on the outside. Did you follow that? Yeah. Inside, what you're seeing is a simulation, a reconstruction of what you're looking at. You're not seeing out there. The simulation is so good that it incorporates space, passing time, motion, everything, and it's like you're in the middle. 9 minutes? 2. I'll get there. Or maybe I'll take 4. Okay. Here is, this is what it looks like in the bigger picture. See these little red lines coming in here? Y'all can't see that over there. Information bits, millions per second, are coming into this little balloon-like thing here. It's got holes in it. They're entering into our inner systems. These are our major inner systems that we know about now in conventional sciences, by the way. Not even in information theory, or certainly not in parapsychology, which is so far behind the times. So, the first thing that the information comes into is our biogenetic and other energies. Right? You're an energy machine walking around, so it has to come into that. Well, my energy is not very good anymore. Then we have trillions of nerve endings. All of these are receptors. So the information bits are modulating through the receptors. We have innate powers. Did you know we have innate powers? Name me one. What? What was the first one? Clairvoyance and intuition, yeah. Any more? Healing? Okay, I'll let that one go. We have chemical and electronic nerve systems. Do we not have them? These information bits are interacting with these chemical and electronic nerve systems. Right? Then there's information channels already set up in our systems, right? Things we've been trained to see and things we've been not trained to see. Or trained not to see, rather. Then we have our own little reality filters. You see down here? And then all of this that up here is what I like to call the bio-brain. You see bio-brain down here? The bio-brain incorporates all of these things here, including its own reality filters. And there's a little circle down here which I've called the cortex. And here's an enlargement of the human neocortex. Did you know that the cortex, do you know this is the seat and the only seat of human perception and consciousness? It's a filament of cells that wrap around the brain, like here. If you unfolded it and trampled it out, it would probably be 21 square feet. If signals do not get into this cortex, you will not perceive anything of those signals. Everything has to get into the cortex in order to be perceived. So the cortex is of extreme importance because each second, the full spectrum of our sensing systems are forwarding to the brain 10 million bits of information signals, but only a few of the signals enter the perceptual cortex. The bottom line result is information signal bits that do not enter the cortex are not perceived because a mental image picture or a simulation of them cannot be constructed on the inside. Are you following me? Great. Okay. A central question now emerges. Can the human perceptual cortex be trained, developed, and enhanced? Come on. It started when you were 1 year old to be trained, right? Everything you do has been trained in the cortex, right? So if Patanjali says that these cities can be trained, what in retrospect is he referring to from the modern retrospect? He's referring to training and developing and enhancing the capabilities of the human cortex. And this is the concept that links every member of our species together, because all of us have a cortex, and if we're not, we're crawling on all fours. Okay? So, if we can train the cortex, one might ask the question, can perception be trained, developed, and enhanced? What did we do at SRI, Russell? Did we train perception?
Certainly did.
We certainly did. Not all people understood that, what was going on, but that's the bottom line of it. All right. I meant to get through 8 of these 9 parts, but I'm told time is up. So this afternoon, we'll pick up 2 parts, and then we'll examine the wonderful work at SRI.